Greetings, welcome back. In this video, we will be discussing immutable distributions, as that appears to be one of the latest buzzwords in the various Linux circles. To be honest, I have not looked into immutable distributions that much before, but I keep hearing the term bandied about, so it behooves me to look at what people are talking about. Who knows? It might actually be the next big thing. Maybe. We'll see. Researching immutable distros turned out to be interesting. Interesting because while the concept is fairly straightforward, the execution of said concept can be a little messy, and I'm suspecting from what I've read that no two immutable distros do it exactly the same way. Anyway, now that I've done my research, I need to actually do some testing, so that's a future project. I actually need to run a few immutable distros to see how they run, how they're put together, what's under the hood, that kind of thing. Then to see how they work and how they perform and whether they actually measure up to the hype. Interestingly, I found some immutable distribution websites to be unenlightening concerning the mechanics while touting benefits. Reminds me of marketing sites, lots of hype, but one must dig for anything substantive. I didn't spend any time digging as I expect it to be obvious and easily accessible from the homepage. To be clear though, this is not every site, just a few of them. Looking at some of the distribution websites, the informative ones, as well as other resources, I think I now have sort of a basic understanding of what it means to be an immutable distribution, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. And interestingly, though not surprising, there are a few different ways to achieve this. We're probably not going to be discussing that as that gets a little technical, and this is going to be fairly high level. But I gotta say, I also suspect some of the claims of immutability are a bit inflated. In this video, I want to discuss immutability as I've learned from my research and give my opinion on it from a high level. Again, like I say, I have not actually loaded an immutable distro yet. That's the next task, but I wanted to do my research first and see how it might affect the Linux landscape. At some point, I need to actually load one up here and do some testing and look under the hood, so that'll be coming up sometime in the future. Okay, according to Webster, immutable means not capable or susceptible to change. From the Latin word immutabilitas, didn't really need to know that. When referring to a Linux distribution, the idea is that users can't make any changes, or at least any lasting changes, to various parts of the actual operating system. How immutable a distribution is will depend on how far developers want to carry the paradigm and how little control the end users are willing to accept. For most methods I can think of off the top of my head, I can easily come up with counters. However, most of this will be for users with more than average skills using their operating system. As I have talked about in previous video about the year of the Linux desktop, the majority of computer users out there have less than average skills when it comes to interacting with and modifying their operating system. One can be an expert in a couple of applications, and a lot of users fall in this category. However, they may not have a clue how their operating system works, nor any desire to learn. From my research, I can see a huge advantage for these users, assuming the immutable distribution has their act together and everything is working properly and they have a decent set of tools. Assuming the distribution has its act together, I could see painless installs that are identical across a wide range of platforms. Same for applications. You install them and they just work. That's probably one of the big selling points. However, I also see the user having to give up some control over their install to make the immutable distribution actually work properly. On the other hand, I do not see any distributions, regardless of claims, being completely immutable. If the developer can do something, someone of sufficient skill will always be able to mess around and undo it. Anyway, let's get on to discussing my thoughts on the matter. All right, before actually talking about immutable distros, I want to take a moment here to discuss how a regular Linux system works before diving into the comparisons of immutable distributions, at least as I understand the concept of immutable distributions at this point. If we look at a normal Linux system distribution, pick any you want, we see a separation between system or kernel space and user space. Taking a high-level look at what could be considered normal Linux install, kernel space sits on top of the hardware. You have your drivers and your modules and the kernel itself, and then some system libraries. To access system functions, we make system calls from user space via some type of shell. It should be noted that the kernel space on a regular Linux system has a certain level of immutability already. Well, let's just say, while not normally accessible to most users, kernel space can be accessed through the granting of elevation of privileges and administrative rights to those users. While applications are shown in user space, in general, it takes administrative rights to install them, as they tend to add libraries, configuration files, binaries, auxiliary programs, and other stuff that needs to exist within the kernel space. I should note that none of this applies to the root user. Root can pretty much do anything they want, access anything they want at any time. And all systems have a root user. However, many systems disable the root account by default. It's one of those security measure things, and rely on tools like sudo and su for managing the operating system when needed. Upgrades are handled by installing updated applications packages that either overwrite or remove older versions. While this approach generally works smoothly, it is assumed that all dependencies have been taken into account. I will say that one of the biggest problems I've had with this type of system in the past is dependency version issues or missing dependencies. They are rare, but they do happen. The package maintainers do a good job of validating the dependencies. However, something as complex as an operating system, bad stuff does occasionally sneak through and happen. And in my experience, these sorts of issues are rare and corrected fairly quickly for the most part. All right, let's look at the immutable distributions next. In an immutable Linux distribution, the entire kernel space, in theory, is wrapped in a read-only container. I'm using containers loosely here as a very generic term and not representative of any specific container type or any particular system. It's just generic. This means that the entire operating system is one large package. A general implication of this is that applications are also containerized as well and not part of the OS or operating system. With a read-only operating system, this would have to be the case, at least without making special exceptions. Most of us have had some exposure to containers. Think Docker, Podman, Flatpaks, Linux containers, app images, or even snaps. Yeah, even snaps. In theory, if not implementation, this is simple. For applications, one puts all the dependencies within the container, correctly configured. Therefore, a container can run on top of almost any Linux system without needing to install or in any way interact with kernel space other than for the few basic calls needed to interact with the hardware. So here's where things get interesting. If containers are pre-configured, they should work, well, they should just work when installed, including the OS container. This also means no messing around with configurations. Things are just supposed to work. This, again, is good in theory. If your operating system is in a read-only container, you do not update it. Instead, you download a new container and you replace the old container when you reboot your system. This does imply multiple OS containers in kernel land. One holds the active OS, the other holds either an older version or a newer version of the next OS. There could be more than two. But this also implies some extra programming that exists outside of the operating system to control which version is booted into. Yeah, I could see this kind of stuff existing within the EFI partition, probably, or maybe. We'll find out when I actually load and run a system. The approach does have distinct advantages in that the operating system is upgraded as a whole, so should have been tested and should work out of the box. Again, so to speak. Assuming one has multiple operating system containers, if the new container does not work, one can simply boot to the previous container. And the same would apply for applications. Okay, from my current perspective, assuming a perfect immutable system and barring some obvious issues, this could lead to a great use experience for new users. I mean, it could be the next great thing. You would have your operating system container where you do not have to worry about configuration or anything. When there's a new update, the entire container gets swapped out, and I'm assuming the same would apply to the applications. So technically, the only thing one would need to actually access would be one's home directory. In most cases, Linux, regardless of distribution, has had some local configuration. These are dot files in your user directory for various aspects of the operating system and applications. So again, in theory, and assuming things have been coded with this in mind, configuration should not, well, some configuration should not be an issue. A read-only container for the operating system does have certain security advantages, the biggest one being any changes should not survive a reboot, as they would be written to memory instead of storage drive. This is assuming the entire OS is read-only and really immutable. The approach in theory sounds good. Assuming a good set of custom tools should be an excellent experience for 80% of the users out there. There should be a minimum amount of configuration to get a system up and running, which works great for people who aren't really interested in playing around the operating system. Again, 80% of the users out there. They don't have to worry about how to set up the operating system or anything like that. It should just work out of the box. And again, assuming good tools from the distribution. For new users and those who don't want to tinker, this could be an exceptional experience. So yeah, it could be the next big thing. To get the OS up and running, just install the OS container, get an application going, just install the container. No worries about dependency issues as they are baked into the containers. Need to update, just download a new container and replace the old one. All your data should remain outside the containers in your home directory and everything should just work. Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of you don't actually believe that. So let's talk about the downside. And you knew it had to be coming. There had to be a downside. For longtime users who like things set up in a certain way or a specific way, like myself, there could be a lot of potential issues. And this will depend on how immutable the OS actually is. If there is one constant in Linux, it is that there are no consistent ways to do things. In most cases, there are multiple methods to the same results, and how much you're going to like immutability will depend on how these results are achieved. From my perspective, I'm going to go through a few issues. The first issue I see is going to be with hardware. The obvious example are your graphics drivers. AMD, NVIDIA, Intel, they all have different drivers. And installing these drivers means modifying the OS, as that is where they work. If you do manage to install them, would they disappear on the next upgrade? I'm sure this has been addressed, and I'm looking forward to seeing how. To my mind, you would have to reduce the immutability somewhat to get the different drivers, or just have different containers with each driver, one for each driver. But that begs the question of what about sound cards or printers or any other piece of customized hardware? What about new hardware? Configuration is going to be another issue. If it can be done in dot files from the user directory, no problem. But what if access to etc or variable or user share, to name a few locations, is required? Configuration of container applications could also be an issue. Basically, one might be stuck with whatever themes and configurations are within that container. I've pointed out before that I put no stock in some of the look and feel arguments. If the button icon menus is there and it works when I click on it, I really do not care what it looks like. However, I do understand that this is important to some, so I bring this up as an issue. Another issue is a known fact that containers of any sort tend to be larger than the package version of the same application, mainly because you have to bake in all the dependencies. It is also a fact that containers tend to take some performance hits because they have to start up, they have all those extra dependencies. This is generally not a large issue on most modern systems with enough horsepower under the hood. You may notice, but it won't be that big. Maybe a second or so. However, on older systems or less powerful systems, like Chromebooks, for example, this could be an issue. I want to mention rebooting after updating. I don't feel this is a big issue, though I do know others who would consider it an issue. One of the reasons they like Linux is not having to reboot after every update. I consider that more of a personal preference rather than an issue with immutable distributions, but put everything up front. Most updates will probably require a reboot in an immutable distribution. The final possible issue I thought about was storage drive layout. While one can take a layered approach, I think this is what Fedora Silverblue does. I look forward to playing around with it. From what I have researched so far, the easiest solution is having multiple read-only operating systems on partitions. So each one would have its own partition, which means this is going to mean far less control over how the drive gets partitioned and laid out. I'm not even going to hazard a guess how this would change things, other than I think a lot of it would be taken out of the end user's hands. But we shall see when I get around to testing some stuff. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me ramble on, but yes, I have been rambling here because I have not actually tried an immutable distribution. I just did my research and I'm making some guesses here, and I'm hoping to satisfy those in the near future by loading up a few in my VirtualBox and seeing how they work. While I'm not a Fedora fan, I'm thinking about starting with Silverblue. Also not a GNOME fan, but oh, what the heck. Vanilla OS, again, not a GNOME fan, but that's another one I want to try. They seem to have some really flashy websites and some interesting ideas, especially about their subsystems. I need to see how that's all put together. And even though they're using GNOME, on the plus side, they ditched Ubuntu for Debian, which is good in my book. I've also seen a lot about NixOS, but I'm a little hesitant about jumping in there. Interesting one that's sort of a outlier, Core ELEC, has also caught my eye as a specialized immutable distro with read-only core. I use Libre ELEC for Kodi, and I know how Libre ELEC compares to Open ELEC, but it might be interesting to see how it compares to Core ELEC as well, and if it's really as immutable. And there are a lot of other ones out there like Carbon OS or Endless OS or Flatcar and the like. I welcome any suggestions for an immutable distribution to try out. I want to get as wide a range of experience under the hood and under my belt as possible. As always, please like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for being here. I've got a couple videos on some other subjects I got to do. Once I pack up to leave the Philippines, I'll probably start working on, I've downloaded a bunch of ISOs right now, but I'll start working on some virtualized immutable distributions at that point. And maybe once I get back to the States, I'll publish some stuff. So we'll see what happens.